The winter air was razor-sharp, slicing through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, a town nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling every sound except the faint hum of hospital lights flickering in the darkness. Dr. Thomas Walker, weary from another 14-hour shift in the trauma unit, stepped out of Pine Ridge General Hospital, pulling his coat tightly around his shoulders. The cold gnawed at his skin, but exhaustion had dulled his senses. As he approached his car, something caught his eye, a dark shape pressed against the hospital's stone wall near the entrance. A dog. At first, it looked like a forgotten pile of blankets, but then it moved, shifting slightly, exhaling a breath of mist into the freezing night. Thomas hesitated, scanning the animal. It was not a small dog, perhaps a Border Collie mix, with a thick coat of black and white fur streaked with gold. It sat motionless, eyes fixed on the hospital doors, as if waiting. Not shivering. Not searching for food. Just waiting. Thomas exhaled slowly. He had seen plenty of strays in big cities, but this was different. There was a stillness to the dog, an unspoken purpose in its amber gaze. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move. The temperature had plummeted below freezing. Even with its thick coat, the dog wouldn't last long in the cold. Why was it sitting here? Against his better judgment, Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out half a protein bar. He crouched and placed it a few feet away, then stepped back. For a moment, the dog remained still. Then, cautiously, it rose to its feet, stepping forward with deliberate movements. It sniffed the food, then ate it with quiet precision. "You're hungry, huh?" Thomas said softly. "Where's your owner?" The wind howled through the parking lot, sending a chill through his body. But the dog didn't run. Instead, it returned to the same spot, lowering itself onto the snow and fixing its gaze once more on the hospital doors. A strange unease crept into Thomas's chest. This wasn't a lost dog. This was an animal waiting for something, or someone. He checked his watch, midnight. His rational mind told him to call animal control, to treat this as nothing more than an unusual stray. And yet, something about the dog's unwavering patience made him pause. Thomas let out a breath. "All right, then. I'll check on you tomorrow." As he turned toward his car, he glanced back one last time. The dog hadn't moved. It sat there, still as stone, a silent guardian in the snow, watching, waiting, for what, Thomas did not yet know. The next evening, Thomas Walker finished his shift earlier than usual. The hospital halls were quieter, the emergency cases fewer. Yet, as he stepped outside, an unsettling familiarity awaited him. The dog was there again. Sitting in the exact same spot against the hospital wall, its body still, its amber eyes fixed on the glass doors of the entrance. A flicker of something passed through Thomas's chest, not fear, not even concern, but a nagging sense that this was no coincidence. Most stray dogs roamed, searching for food, warmth, or companionship. But this one, it was waiting. Thomas approached cautiously, noting the paw prints in the snow, evidence that the dog had barely moved from the spot since last night. He had expected it to be gone by morning, but now, its presence felt almost deliberate. "You again," Thomas murmured, his voice softer than he intended. The dog didn't flinch, didn't wag its tail, didn't show any signs of typical canine enthusiasm. Instead, it simply blinked slowly, acknowledging him, then returned its gaze to the hospital doors. Thomas exhaled. His medical training told him not to anthropomorphize animals, but something about the way this dog watched the entrance felt unsettlingly human. Was it waiting for someone? He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small container of water and a piece of bread from his lunch. He set them down at a safe distance. The dog took its time, moving with quiet grace, eating without hesitation but without urgency. Once finished, it returned to its spot, its posture unwavering. 5 nights in a row, the routine remained the same. The dog arrived at dusk, settled near the hospital wall, watched the doors, and remained until the first light of morning. It never barked, never begged, never moved beyond the parking lot. By the sixth night, a storm rolled in, the wind lashing against the hospital building, snow thickening the air. Thomas stepped outside, expecting the spot to be empty. But the dog was still there. Now, its coat was dusted white with fresh snow, its body curled slightly against the bitter cold. A wave of emotion tightened in Thomas's chest, sympathy, curiosity, something deeper he couldn't name. He returned inside, searched through the hospital's storage room, and found an old insulated container. Lining it with thermal blankets, he carried it outside, setting it a few feet away from the entrance. "You can't stay out in this," he said, kneeling near the makeshift shelter. "I don't know why you're here, but I can't let you freeze." For the first time, the dog hesitated. It looked at the box, then back at Thomas. Then, cautiously, it stepped forward, sniffed the entrance, and finally curled up inside. Yet even as it settled into warmth, its eyes remained on the hospital doors, waiting. And for the first time, Thomas found himself wanting to know why. The storm arrived with a vengeance. Thick snow swirled through the streets of Pine Ridge, blanketing everything in white. The wind howled through the town like a wounded animal, rattling windows and cutting through even the warmest layers of clothing. By midnight, temperatures had plummeted dangerously low, the kind of cold that turned breath into ice and stole the warmth from anything exposed too long. Inside Pine Ridge General Hospital, Dr. Thomas Walker finished suturing the last patient of his shift. The ER was quieter than usual, most people had stayed off the roads, knowing the storm was unforgiving. He sighed, rubbing his temples, exhaustion weighing down his every step as he prepared to leave for the night. But then he remembered. The dog. A sense of unease gripped his chest. He had seen animals endure harsh conditions before, but this storm was different. No dog, no matter how resilient, could survive outside in such cold for long. Still, a part of him reasoned that maybe, just maybe, the dog had finally left, seeking shelter elsewhere. Maybe he wouldn't find it there tonight. Yet, as he pushed open the hospital doors, there it was. Curled into a tight ball against the stone wall, its fur caked in snow, its body unnaturally still. Only the faint rise and fall of its chest reassured him that it was still alive. For a long moment, Thomas just stood there, staring. A war waged within him, logic against instinct, reason against emotion. He had always prided himself on being practical, rational, detached when necessary. He had seen people in pain, people left behind. He had learned not to let every tragedy weigh on his soul. But something about this dog felt different. His hands clenched at his sides. If he left now, there was a good chance the dog wouldn't survive until morning. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Moving quickly, he retrieved the insulated container he had placed outside a few nights ago. Snow had almost buried it, but it was still intact. He grabbed his scarf, wrapped it into a small makeshift bed inside the box, and placed it closer to the entrance, where the building's heat might reach it. Then, he knelt in the snow. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Let's get you warm." The dog lifted its head slowly, amber eyes dull from exhaustion. It hesitated, its body stiff and slow from the cold. But as Thomas gently reached out, offering warmth instead of force, something in the dog's instincts relaxed. With great effort, it dragged itself forward, its movements sluggish but deliberate, and stepped into the shelter. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're safe now," he said softly. But even as the dog nestled into warmth, its gaze never wavered from the hospital doors, still waiting for someone who would never return. And for the first time, Thomas knew he needed to find out why. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a town buried in snow. Pine Ridge looked pristine, untouched, but beneath the beauty lay the harsh reality of the freezing cold. Dr. Thomas Walker arrived early at the hospital, his thoughts preoccupied with the dog he had sheltered the night before. Had it survived? He quickened his pace toward the entrance, expecting to find an empty shelter, half hoping the animal had wandered off somewhere safer. But the dog was still there. Curled inside the insulated box, its fur still damp from melted snow, It lay in quiet vigilance. And just like before, its eyes remained locked on the hospital doors. Thomas exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and growing curiosity settling in his chest. "What are you waiting for?" he wanted to ask. As he stood there, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You found Max." Thomas turned sharply to see an elderly woman standing a few feet away, bundled in a thick wool coat, her face lined with the weight of years. She looked at the dog not with surprise, but with recognition. "Excuse me?" Thomas asked, frowning. She took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving the dog. "That's Max. He belonged to my neighbor, Edward Blackwood." At the mention of the name, something shifted in Thomas's mind, a faint recollection, a hospital file, an obituary he might have skimmed over. "Edward Blackwood," he repeated. The woman, Martha Holloway, nodded. "He passed away here a month ago." Her voice softened. "And Max, well, he's been waiting for him ever since." The words landed heavily in Thomas's chest. He looked down at Max, the loyal, unyielding sentinel. Suddenly, the past few nights made sense, the unwavering watchfulness, the way the dog never moved from this spot, the reason it never searched for food or shelter. This wasn't just a stray. This was a dog who had lost his person, but refused to believe it. "Edward found him as a pup, after a storm," Martha continued, her voice laced with the weight of memory. "Barely clinging to life. He raised Max, trained him, took him on hikes through the valley." She sighed, her breath forming a mist in the cold air. They were inseparable. And then, Edward got sick. A hollow sensation settled in Thomas's stomach. "He was brought here in his final days," Martha said. "Max must have followed him, thinking he'd come back out." Her eyes glistened. "But he never did." Thomas swallowed hard, glancing back at Max, whose patient amber eyes still watched the hospital doors, waiting for a man who would never return. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something unfamiliar claw at his chest. Not just sympathy. Responsibility. He had spent his entire career saving lives. Now, he had to figure out how to save this one. That night, Dr. Thomas Walker sat at his desk in the hospital's break room, staring at his computer screen. The conversation with Martha Holloway lingered in his mind, each word pressing deeper into his thoughts. Edward Blackwood. A name that, until today, had been just another entry in a patient file, one among many who had come through the hospital's doors, fought their battles, and lost. But now, Edward's story felt unfinished. Thomas pulled up the hospital's records, scanning for Edward's file. 72 years old. Retired wildlife biologist. Terminal pancreatic cancer. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, yet the details painted a picture Thomas could now see more clearly. Edward had refused aggressive treatment. He had been admitted only when the pain had become unbearable, spending his final days in room 214 under the care of Dr. Patel in oncology. But then something caught Thomas's eye. A notation from a night nurse stood out in the file. Patient requested room transfer to face the hospital entrance on his last night. Thomas's stomach tightened. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The request had been granted, though no one had questioned why at the time. But now, it made sense. Edward had known Max was out there. Even in his final hours, he had been thinking of his dog. Thomas rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. In all his years of practicing medicine, he had seen love and loss in many forms, but something about this hit differently. He had witnessed families say goodbye, seen grief unfold in quiet hospital rooms, but never like this. He wasn't sure what compelled him next. Maybe it was curiosity, or something deeper, but he found himself searching Edward's home address in the hospital's patient records. The house was located on the outskirts of town, at the edge of the valley, nestled between the timberline and open wilderness. It was isolated. Remote. A place where a man and his dog could exist without the world intruding. Thomas drummed his fingers against the desk, debating his next move. He wasn't one to chase ghosts, to dwell on things he couldn't change. But Max's unwavering vigil haunted him in a way he couldn't ignore. Edward was gone. But Max was still here. And Max was waiting. With a heavy sigh, Thomas shut his laptop and reached for his car keys. He had never met Edward Blackwood in life, but maybe, just maybe, he could understand him in death. And maybe, by understanding Edward, he could finally figure out how to help the dog that refused to let him go. The drive to Edward Blackwood's house took longer than expected. The roads were slick with ice, and the towering pines lining the route swayed under the weight of fresh snow. Thomas Walker gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing faster than the car itself. He wasn't sure what he expected to find at Edward's home, perhaps an answer, perhaps nothing at all. But if there was even a small chance that the key to helping Max lay somewhere in Edward's past, he had to see for himself. At last, he pulled onto a narrow dirt path, the tires crunching over frozen gravel. The house sat at the end of the road, a modest wooden cabin, its exterior weathered by time and solitude. It was exactly the kind of place he imagined Edward would have lived, secluded, surrounded by nature, a place where a man and his dog could exist in quiet harmony. Stepping out of the car, Thomas hesitated for a brief moment before making his way up the porch steps. A "For Sale by Estate" sign stood near the front, a stark reminder that the cabin's owner would never return. He found the spare key under a loose stone near the door, a common hiding place in small towns like this. When he stepped inside, the air was cold, filled with the faint scent of wood smoke and old books. The living room was simple, shelves lined with wildlife field guides, a worn leather chair near the fireplace, and on the coffee table, a stack of letters never sent. But it was the small desk in the corner that caught Thomas's eye. On top of it lay a notebook, its edges curled with use. As he flipped through the pages, he quickly realized what it was. Edward's journal. Each entry was detailed and methodical, chronicling Max's growth from a tiny pup to a fully grown dog. Max explored further today. His instincts are strong. He's learning the land. Introduced him to tracking exercises. He's picking up scents quickly. Almost ready to start hunting on his own. Thomas flipped further, his eyes scanning the words. He's nearly ready for independence, but I worry I won't be here to finish the process. Time is running short, for both of us. Then, the final entry. I can barely write today. The pain is worse. Martha taking me to the hospital tomorrow. Max senses something is wrong. He stayed by my bed all night. Hardest part of dying is leaving him before his journey is complete. He deserves his wild life. Hope someone will help him find his way. Thomas closed the notebook, swallowing the lump forming in his throat. This wasn't just a dog mourning his owner. Max had been waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. And now, that responsibility had fallen to him. The drive back from Edward Blackwood's cabin felt heavier than before. Dr. Thomas Walker now carried something he hadn't expected, a responsibility he hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. Max wasn't just a lost dog mourning his owner. He was a creature in transition, caught between the world of humans and the wild, waiting for someone to guide him toward the life he had been promised. That night, as Thomas arrived at the hospital, Max was there, as always, sitting near the entrance, waiting. But now, Thomas saw him differently. This wasn't just a dog refusing to leave a place of comfort. This was an animal holding on to the last thread of the only life he had ever known. Thomas crouched down, watching Max carefully. I know why you're here, he murmured. But Edward isn't coming back. The dog lifted his head slightly at the sound of his voice, ears twitching. I read his journal, Thomas continued, his voice steady but low. He was getting you ready, so you could be free. For the first time, Max turned his gaze away from the hospital doors and looked directly at Thomas. Something in those amber eyes made Thomas's chest tighten. He understood. The next morning, Thomas made a call to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in wildlife rehabilitation. If anyone could help guide Max toward the life Edward had planned for him, it was her. Elena, "I have an unusual case," Thomas said when she answered. "I deal with unusual every day," she replied with a hint of humor. "What's going on?" Thomas explained everything: Max's strange vigil, Edward's training, the unfulfilled plan. Elena was silent for a long moment. "Normally, we discourage human-raised animals from re-entering the wild," she said finally. "But, if Edward trained him well enough, and Max still has his instincts, it might be possible." "What would we need to do?" "A transitional release," she said. "We'd have to reintroduce him gradually, let him learn to hunt, survive on his own. It won't happen overnight." Thomas glanced at Max, who sat a few feet away, ears alert as if listening. "I don't care how long it takes," he said. "We owe him that much." For the next few nights, the routine changed. Instead of simply leaving food near the shelter, Thomas began introducing small challenges, placing the food inside an obstacle, making Max work for it. It was a small step, but Max learned quickly, just as Edward had written in his journal. And something else happened, too. For the first time, Max no longer spent the entire night staring at the hospital doors. Little by little, he was looking elsewhere, toward the woods, toward the world Edward had wanted for him. The transition had begun. The morning air was crisp and biting as Dr. Thomas Walker loaded the transport crate into the back of his SUV. The past few weeks had been a slow but deliberate process. Each night, Max had been challenged to rely more on his instincts, to become less dependent on human presence. He had learned quickly. Now, it was time for the final step. Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself. Across the parking lot, Max stood near his shelter, watching him. He was no longer the same dog that had waited outside the hospital doors night after night. His coat was thicker, his muscles leaner, his movements sharper. But there was still something in his amber eyes, a quiet understanding, as if he knew what was coming. "Elena and her team are waiting for us at the release site," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to Max. He had never done anything like this before. Letting go had never been his strength. Max had become more than just a mystery to solve. He had become a connection to something bigger: Edward, loyalty, purpose. Yet, this was not a goodbye. This was a promise kept. With patience, Thomas led Max toward the crate. The dog hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, settling down without protest. It was as if he trusted Thomas to take him where he needed to go. The drive took over an hour, winding through the thick pine forests and frozen valleys of Colorado. The release site, a remote, protected wildlife reserve, had been chosen carefully. It was far from roads and human settlements, but rich with food and water sources. As Thomas pulled onto the narrow dirt road, Dr. Elena Rodriguez and her team were already there, making the final preparations. "You ready?" she asked as he stepped out. Thomas glanced at the crate. "I don't know," he admitted. She gave a small smile. "He is." They carried the crate into a temporary enclosure nestled between towering evergreens. It was designed for soft release. Max would stay here for a few days, adjusting to his surroundings before the door was left open, giving him the choice to leave when he was ready. The moment the crate door opened, Max stepped out cautiously, his nose lifting to catch the sense of the wild. Thomas held his breath. For a moment, Max simply stood there. Then, he took a step forward. And another. His ears flicked at the distant rustling of trees. His eyes scanned the horizon. Then, he turned, just once, looking at Thomas. A final acknowledgement. And then, with quiet grace, Max walked forward into the trees, his dark coat blending into the forest. He never looked back. Thomas exhaled, feeling something shift inside him. Edward's promise had been fulfilled. Max was finally where he belonged. The forest was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but one filled with life just beyond sight, branches swaying, distant birds calling, the whisper of the wind moving through the pines. Max was gone. Dr. Thomas Walker stood motionless, eyes locked on the space where the dog had disappeared. A part of him had expected Max to hesitate, to look back again. But no, when the moment came, Max had stepped into his new life without fear, without doubt. It was Thomas who felt the weight of the parting. Beside him, Dr. Elena Rodriguez shifted, watching his expression carefully. "You did right by him," she said softly. Thomas swallowed, his throat tight. "It doesn't feel that way." She gave a small, knowing smile. "That's because we don't get to keep the things we love. We just get to help them find where they're meant to be." The words sank deep. For years, Thomas had built his life around saving people. He had seen countless patients come and go, some walking out of the hospital doors, some never leaving at all. He had learned to detach, to accept loss as part of the job. But this was different. Max hadn't just been a patient or a case to solve. He had been proof that love, true, unwavering loyalty, didn't fade with death. Max had waited for Edward, believing in something bigger than himself. And now, it was Thomas who had to learn to let go. A gust of wind blew through the clearing, kicking up a dusting of fresh snow. Elena squeezed his shoulder gently before stepping away, giving him a moment alone. Thomas took a deep breath and let his gaze drift toward the tree line. "Goodbye, Max," he murmured. "Be free." With a final glance at the forest, he turned toward his car. The drive back was quiet. The roads, the sky, the entire world seemed different. Lighter, somehow. As if something that had been pressing on his chest for years had finally lifted. Back in Pine Ridge, he pulled into the hospital parking lot out of habit, but as he stepped out of his car, the absence was immediate. For the first time in weeks, there was no quiet figure waiting by the doors. A strange ache filled his chest. He had known it would feel this way. Had prepared for it. But knowing and feeling were two different things. That night, before heading home, Thomas printed a photo, one taken by a wildlife camera Elena had set up at the release site. It was a simple image, Max, moving through the trees, his body lean and strong, his head high. A wild creature exactly where he belonged. Thomas placed the photo in a small frame on his desk. A reminder. Not of loss, but of a promise kept. Winter in Pine Ridge slowly gave way to spring. The snowbanks that had once lined the streets melted into streams that rushed down the mountain slopes, feeding the rivers below. The air, though still crisp, carried the scent of earth and pine, of something new beginning. But for Dr. Thomas Walker, the world still felt strangely quiet. It had been 3 weeks since he had last seen Max. Since the moment the dog had stepped beyond the tree line, disappearing into the wild as if he had never belonged anywhere else. And yet, in the quiet moments of his day, Thomas still found himself looking for him. Each time he left the hospital, his eyes flicked instinctively toward the entrance. Each morning, he felt a fleeting expectation, as if he might walk outside and see those amber eyes staring back at him. But the entrance remained empty. No waiting figure. No silent sentinel in the snow. It should have felt like closure, but instead, it felt like something unfinished. Then, one evening, as Thomas sat in his office reviewing patient files, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Dr. Elena Rodriguez. "Got something for you. Thought you might want to see it." Attached was a photo. With a furrowed brow, Thomas opened it. And then, he stopped breathing. It was Max. Captured by a remote wildlife camera, the image showed him moving through a clearing in the forest, his body strong and sure, his fur thick and gleaming in the light of dawn. His posture had changed, no longer a dog waiting for something to return, no longer caught between two worlds. Max looked free. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a deep, quiet sense of peace. He exhaled slowly, staring at the photo. This was what Edward had wanted. Not for Max to wait endlessly at a hospital door, clinging to a past that could never return. But for him to step forward, to live the life he had been meant for. With quiet reverence, Thomas printed the photo and placed it in a small wooden frame. Then, he set it on his desk, beside the clutter of medical reports and hospital schedules. A reminder, not of loss, but of purpose. because Max had not been the only one waiting. For years, Thomas had been moving through life without really living it, carrying the weight of too many tragedies, too many losses. But now, staring at the image of a dog who had found his way, he realized something simple but profound. Moving forward wasn't forgetting. Letting go wasn't losing. It was just the next step. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on the photograph for a moment longer before he finally closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt light. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge, bringing with it the first bloom of wildflowers. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and life, in its quiet way, moved forward. But there was one thing left unfinished. One morning, Dr. Thomas Walker drove to Pine Ridge Cemetery. He had spoken with Dr. Patel, who had agreed that Edward Blackwood deserved a tribute, something small, something meaningful. They found Edward's grave beneath the shade of a tall pine, simple and unadorned, marked only by a standard headstone. But today, Thomas carried something with him, a bronze plaque, freshly engraved. He knelt, brushing away fallen leaves before setting it into place at the base of the stone. The inscription read, "Friend to wild things. A promise kept, a life set free." He ran his fingers over the words, feeling the weight of them. Edward had spent his life understanding the wilderness, helping one small creature find its place in the world. And in the end, Thomas had been the one to make sure that promise was fulfilled. Dr. Patel stood beside him, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. He would have liked this. Thomas nodded. So would Max. The two men lingered for a moment longer, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth around them. And then, as if on cue, a rustle came from the nearby trees. They turned just in time to see a dark shape move through the brush, silent, swift, gone in an instant. Thomas smiled. Maybe, just maybe, Max had come to say goodbye. Life at Pine Ridge General Hospital returned to its usual rhythm. Patients came and went, emergencies rose and fell, and Dr. Thomas Walker continued his work, mending wounds, easing pain, saving lives. But something had changed. There was a lightness in his step, a quiet shift in his heart. For years, he had carried the weight of too many goodbyes, but Max had taught him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn: letting go wasn't losing. It was an act of love. One evening, as he stepped out of the hospital, habit made his eyes drift toward the entrance. For the first time in weeks, he didn't expect to see a waiting figure. Yet, instead of feeling emptiness, he felt something else. Peace. He looked at the photo on his desk every morning, Max, free and strong in the wild, just as Edward had wanted. Just as he had helped him become. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas thought about his own life. About the days ahead, about the things he had pushed aside, hikes he had meant to take, friendships he had neglected, moments he had let slip away. Maybe it was time. Maybe helping Max find his way had helped him find his own. With one last glance at the sky, where the last light of the sun faded behind the mountains, Thomas stepped forward. For the first time in years, he wasn't just leaving work. He was moving toward something new.